Mr. President, I rise today to join the American people in celebrating Black History Month. But it should be noted that the immeasurable role of African Americans have had in making the United States the strong nation it is today cannot be fully recognized in one short month. Black history is American history. This February, we highlight the titans of African American history, Marylanders such as Harriet Ross Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Thurgood Marshall, icons including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Dr. Dorothy Height, and contemporary heroes like John Lewis and Mae Jemison. We all celebrate the countless men and women whose names will never grace the history books or newspapers, those who fought each day for freedom and equality, those who pushed the limits of innovation, and those who endured and overcame hardships over the centuries. As we celebrate, the struggle to ensure all Americans are treated equally under the law rages on. I believe that as much as Black History Month is about reflecting on a rich past, it's also a time for all Americans to contemplate how to create a better future. It's not enough simply to recognize the great contributions that African Americans have made. To honor those who have come before us, we must use Black History Month as a springboard to bring about positive change in America. I have a number of legislative priorities that relate directly to Black History Month and to building a better future. Mr. President, I take pride in being from Baltimore for many reasons. I know all my colleagues are familiar with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP for short. The NAACP celebrates its 107th anniversary on the 12th of this month. The NAACP is headquartered in Baltimore City. The motto of the NAACP is "One Nation Working Together for Justice and Equality Everywhere." The motto is fitting because for the last 107 years, this is exactly what the NAACP and its more than 500,000 members have done. I've introduced legislation to honor the legacy of the civil rights champion, executive director of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, Solicitor General, Supreme Court Justice, and Baltimorean Thurgood Marshall. The legislation would direct the National Park Service to determine the suitability of including his alma mater, Public School 103 in West Baltimore, as a National Historic Site. The stories of Justice Thurgood Marshall, reading the Constitution in the basement of PS 103 during detention typifies the American dream. Preserving PS 103 would not only be a fitting tribute to a great Marylander, but also an enduring symbol of the importance of education in shaping great civic-minded Americans. I understand that the legislation may be included in the Energy Policy Modernization Act that the Senate may consider again in the near future, and I hope the Senate will approve this amendment. Mr. President, I just mentioned education. And during Black History Month, I think there are few topics more important to promoting equality than ensuring that all Americans have access to a high-quality, affordable education. In December of last year, Congress enacted the Every Student Succeeds Act in a strong bipartisan manner. I hope that the members of this body can build on the momentum by confronting the pressing issues of college affordability and student debt. I am a strong supporter of President Obama's America's College Promise proposal to provide 2 years of community college education tuition-free for responsible students. This proposal will allow students to earn the first 2 years of a 4-year degree or the critical skills necessary to enter the workforce without having to take on decades of debt before they even embark on their career. While student debt is a critical problem for nearly 42 million Americans, paying for higher education can be especially difficult for African American families. According to the Urban Institute, since the mid-2000s, African American families on average have carried more student loan debt than white families. This is driven in large part by the growing share of African American families that take on student debt. In 2013, 42% of African Americans ages 25 to 55 had student loan debt, compared with 28% of whites. Because African American families on average have less wealth and fewer private resources, they may be more likely to turn to loans to finance their education. Mr. President, education is the great equalizer in our society. As a nation, we cannot afford to price Americans of any race out of education and the opportunities of quality education provides. The main higher education equalizer, the federal Pell Grant, provides its lowest share of college education costs since its enactment in 1965. As a result, more than 61% of the students who receive a federal Pell Grant award have to take out loans compared to only 29% of their more affluent peers. With more than 60% of African American undergraduate students utilizing the federal Pell Grant to pay for their education, this places an undue burden on African American communities for decades. During Black History Month and beyond, I will continue to support legislation that helps ease the burden of paying for higher education. Mr. President, in the last year, Baltimore and many cities across the United States have been inundated with news crews covering the deaths of unarmed black men and women at the hands of police officers. Long before the unrest that gripped Baltimore last spring, I had introduced a number of bills seeking to empower communities and rebuild trust between the citizens and police departments. Events in Baltimore, Charleston, Cleveland, Chicago, and many other places show the urgent need for congressional action. That's why I introduced the Baltimore Act, which would help communities nationwide by building and lifting trust in order to multiply opportunities and racial equality. The Baltimore Act is a package of legislation made up of bills that I have previously introduced, along with several new additions. Many provisions in the Baltimore Act enjoy bipartisan support. Title I of the Baltimore Act includes law enforcement reform provisions to help better train and equip law enforcement officers so they can better serve communities across the country. The first provision contained within the Baltimore Act is the End Racial Profiling Act. The End Racial Profiling Act would ban racial and discriminatory profiling by state and local law enforcement and require mandatory data collection and reporting. Think about this for a moment. In 2016, there is no national standard against law enforcement officers stopping someone merely because of his or her race. I am pleased in Maryland that Attorney General Brian Frost recently issued guidelines prohibiting the use of discriminatory profiling by state and local law enforcement in Maryland. And the Attorney General of the United States has acted. But we need a national standard with the force of law that would prohibit the use of discriminatory profiling by any federal, state, or local law enforcement officer. The second provision deals with state and local accountability. It would require local law enforcement officials receiving burn or JAG and COPS hiring program funds to submit officer training information to the Department of Justice. That information would include how officers are trained in the use of force, racial and ethnic bias, de-escalating conflicts, and constructive engagement with the public. The Police Camera Act would establish a pilot program to assist local law enforcement in purchasing or leasing body-worn cameras. I am pleased that several provisions that are consistent with the Baltimore Act were included in the FY16 appropriations measure enacted by Congress in December. The appropriations legislation directs the Department of Justice to swiftly devise and submit plans to improve training levels in use of force, identifying racial and ethnic bias, and conflict resolution for state and local law enforcement officers. It urges DOJ to partner with national law enforcement organizations to promote consistent standards for high-quality training and assessment, and directs the agency to better collect state and local law enforcement data on the use of force. I also want to mention that I introduced the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act, which would help local law enforcement agencies strengthen their department and combat officer misconduct. The Baltimore Act deals with voting right reform and civil rights restoration. The Democracy Restoration Act would make citizens who have returned from incarceration eligible to vote. At the state level, I was proud to see that the Maryland State Senate recently overturned our governor's veto of a state statute expanding the rights to vote for people who have served their time. I want to reduce recidivism and give people a stake in their communities. If you want to do that, they need to have a voice and a vote. The Democracy Restoration Act would also restore one's eligibility to serve on a federal jury. Congress should also enact legislation to restore the Voting Rights Act and reverse the damage done by the Supreme Court decisions that undermine the fundamental right to vote as Americans, to cast their votes for the presidential primary elections of 2016. The Baltimore Act also deals with sentencing reform. Over the years, sentencing in this country has been marred by racial disparities. The discrepancy between jail time for crack and powder cocaine users is only one such example. The RESET Act would reclassify specific low-level nonviolent drug possession felonies as misdemeanors and eliminate the aforementioned distinctions between crack and powder cocaine. I am pleased to be able to say that the sentencing reform is a bipartisan issue, and I look forward to working with any member who is willing to ensure that all Americans are treated equally under the law. I hope the Senate will take up legislation to address some of the disparities in the very near future. And finally, Mr. President, the Baltimore Act addresses reentry and employment law reforms. I think this section is especially important because once someone has served his or her sentence, that person should be able to start anew and should get a fair shot to reenter the workforce. I would be remiss if I did not mention Second Chance, Inc., a Baltimore nonprofit that trains returning citizens in deconstruction and architectural salvage, and much more. I've had a chance to meet with the staff of Second Chance, and I can tell you that the reentry and job program should be a national model. I would invite my colleagues to learn more about the good work that is being done only a short drive north of here. I am pleased that the administration has banned the box when it comes to hiring for federal contracts so that ex-offenders can get the second chance to rejoin our communities as productive and working members of society. I am pleased that the state of Maryland, as well as Baltimore City, Montgomery County, and Prince George's County have all banned the box in various forms, and I urge the private sector to follow suit. Helping ex-offenders find gainful employment is a win-win by reducing social services costs, increasing tax revenues, and making our communities safer. Mr. President, eliminating disparities in our justice system is critically important. It is just as important to eliminate disparities in the quality of health care available between groups of Americans. In Baltimore, living in certain African-American neighborhoods instead of a white neighborhood, separated by only a few miles, can shorten life expectancy as much as 30 years, a full generation. That is unacceptable. As a senator with a long-standing record of working to promote health equity, including my legislation establishing the offices of minority health through the Department of Health and Human Services and elevating the National Institutes of Health's National Center on Minority Health and Health Disparities to an institute, I will say that we've made progress in shrinking disparities, but I'm far from satisfied. I'm very encouraged to see that NIH received $2 billion increase in FY16 omnibus spending bill. That's very important. That's the largest increase NIH has received since 2003. The National Institute for Minority Health and Health Disparities received $278 million. This is an increase of $8.7 million over its FY15 enacted level. Make no mistake, that money will help save lives. Thanks to the Affordable Care Act, we've recently made health coverage more accessible and affordable than it has been in decades. By reducing the number of uninsured Americans across the country, the ACA is working to address health inequalities. For instance, between 2013 and 2014, the percentage of uninsured African Americans fell by 6.8%. Also, because of the ACA, there is increased funding available for community health clinics. 300,000 Marylanders, including more than 140,000 African Americans, are served by these clinics. Under the ACA, preventive services, which are critical to the early detection and treatment of many diseases that disproportionately affect minorities, are now free for 76 million Americans, including 1.5 million Marylanders. Some of what Congress can do to shrink health disparities is not limited to health care policy making. Recent events in Flint, Michigan have brought to light the need to focus on environmental justice issues. Flint is a case study in what happens when environmental stewardship and water infrastructure needs are ignored. It's also an example of how pollution can hurt minority populations in a severe way. Flint's population is about 100,000 people. Roughly 56% are African Americans. The residents of Flint will have to live with the complications of lead poisoning for the rest of their lives. What disturbs me the most, both as a grandfather and as a member of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, is the very real possibility that children may have suffered irreversible damage in their developing brains from exposure to lead in drinking water. Exposure even to a low-level lead can profoundly affect children's behavior, growth rates, and their intelligence over time. I might point out that Freddie Gray, the person who was killed in Baltimore, had high levels of lead in his blood. Elevated levels of bloodstream may cause learning disabilities and other developmental issues. I'd like to quote from an article in the New York Times from January 29th of this year. Emails released by the office of Michigan Governor Rick Snyder last week referred to a resident who said she was told by a state nurse in January 2015 regarding her son's elevated blood level, and it quotes, "It's just a few IQ points. It's not the end of the world." Mr. President, it's a crisis when we deny a child his or her full potential by exposing them to lead. This crisis could have been avoided. It is going to affect an entire generation of children in Flint to a varying degree. Sadly, Flint is not alone among the cities in which pollution is harming African Americans at a disproportionately alarming rate. Nationally, African Americans are 20% likely to have asthma versus non-Hispanic whites. According to a study of the Annual Review of Public Health, many African American children live in more heavily polluted areas. Living in urban centers increases one's exposure to traffic and industrial pollution, which promotes a greater sensitivity to allergens. Mr. President, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, Black History Month is about reflecting on a rich path, but also a time for all Americans to contemplate how to create a better future. The Senate is capable of great things. Landmark bills like the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Fair Housing Act of 1968, all passed through this chamber. I call on my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in both houses of Congress to transfer the goodwill and kind words about Black History Month into meaningful legislation to help African Americans and all Americans. I've presented only a small portion of my legislative priorities today, and I know that other senators may have different ways of approaching some of these same challenges. In honor of the countless men and women who have contributed to making this country great, let us work together to get something done for the American people.